The Great War, a complete documentary. The summer of 1914 began like any other in Europe. Children played in village squares, farmers tended their fields, and diplomats exchanged polite correspondence in grand palaces. Few could have imagined that within months, an entire continent would be engulfed in flames, and the world would be forever changed by what would become known as the Great War. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. This single gunshot would echo across Europe like thunder, awakening ancient rivalries and setting in motion a catastrophic chain of events. The Archduke's death provided Austria-Hungary with the pretext it had long sought to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all. But Europe in 1914 was not a collection of independent nations acting alone. Instead, it was a powder keg of alliances, each country bound by treaty to defend its allies. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, Russia mobilized to support its Slavic ally. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, found itself at war with Germany. And when German forces invaded Belgium to outflank French defenses, Britain honored its guarantee of Belgian neutrality and entered the conflict. Within 6 weeks of the Archduke's assassination, most of Europe was at war. What had begun as a localized Balkan crisis had mushroomed into a continental catastrophe. The German strategy, known as the Schlieffen Plan, called for a rapid knockout blow against France before turning east to face Russia. German forces swept through Belgium and northern France, coming within 30 miles of Paris before being stopped at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan fundamentally altered the nature of the conflict. Instead of the quick, decisive campaign that military leaders had predicted, the war settled into a deadly stalemate. Both sides dug elaborate networks of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Between these opposing lines lay no man's land, a hellish landscape of barbed wire, shell craters, and death. Life in the trenches was a nightmare that defied description. Soldiers lived like rats in muddy holes, sharing their cramped quarters with lice, rats, and the ever-present threat of death. The smell of cordite, rotting flesh, and human waste created an assault on the senses that many veterans could never forget. Disease was rampant. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, could lead to gangrene and amputation. Shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, left thousands of men broken in mind and spirit. The weapons of the Great War brought industrial age efficiency to the ancient business of killing. Machine guns could fire 600 rounds per minute, mowing down attacking infantry like wheat before a scythe. Artillery bombardments could be heard hundreds of miles away, and a single shell could obliterate dozens of men. Poison gas, first used by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, added a new dimension of horror to warfare. Chlorine and phosgene gas burned the lungs and blinded the eyes, while mustard gas caused agonizing burns and could kill days or weeks after exposure. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 epitomized the futility and horror of trench warfare. British forces, confident that a week-long artillery barrage had destroyed German defenses, launched a massive assault on July 1st. Instead, they walked into a wall of machine gun fire. By the end of the first day, the British had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead. The battle continued for 4 months, with British and French forces advancing barely 6 miles at the cost of over 1 million casualties on all sides. Verdun, also fought in 1916, became a symbol of French determination and German ruthlessness. The German strategy was simple: attack a position the French could not afford to lose and bleed them while defending it. The battle raged for 10 months, with fighting sometimes occurring hand-to-hand in underground tunnels. French General Philippe Pétain organized a system called the Sacred Way, a continuous convoy of trucks bringing fresh troops and supplies to the front. By the battle's end, both sides had lost roughly 300,000 men each, and the front lines had barely moved. As the war dragged on, entire societies were mobilized for the conflict. Factories converted to weapons production, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and governments assumed unprecedented control over their citizens' lives. Food rationing became common, and propaganda campaigns urged civilians to buy war bonds, conserve resources, and hate the enemy. The distinction between soldier and civilian, always fragile, began to disappear entirely. The war at sea introduced new forms of warfare that would have profound implications for civilian populations. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant vessels and passenger ships without warning. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, which killed 1,198 civilians, including 128 Americans, shocked the world and began to turn American opinion against Germany. Unrestricted submarine warfare would eventually draw the United States into the conflict. On the Eastern Front, the war took on a different character. Here, armies remained mobile, fighting across the vast expanses of Poland and Russia. The Russian army, poorly equipped and badly led, suffered devastating defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in 1914. Despite occasional successes, such as the Brusilov offensive of 1916, Russian forces were steadily ground down by German and Austrian armies. The strain of war proved too much for the Russian Empire. Military disasters, economic collapse, and social unrest combined to create a revolutionary situation. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and a provisional government took power. This government, however, made the fatal decision to continue the war. Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Party, returned to Russia with German assistance and promised peace, land, and bread. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power and began negotiating a separate peace with Germany. The Russian Revolution had enormous implications for the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 freed up hundreds of thousands of German troops for transfer to the Western Front. Germany now had one last chance to win the war before American reinforcements could tip the balance. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 initially achieved stunning success, breaking through Allied lines and advancing closer to Paris than at any time since 1914. But the German army was a spent force. Years of blockade had weakened the home front, and the army itself was exhausted and depleted. American troops were now arriving in France at a rate of 300,000 per month, bringing fresh energy and resources to the Allied cause. By August 1918, the tide had turned decisively. The 100 Days Offensive, led by British forces under General Henry Rawlinson and French forces under Marshal Ferdinand Foch, rolled back German gains and began driving toward Germany itself. The end came with shocking suddenness. Germany's allies began to collapse. Bulgaria signed an armistice in September 1918, followed by Ottoman Turkey in October and Austria-Hungary in early November. German civilians, starving and war-weary, rose in revolution. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to Holland, and a new German government sought peace at any price. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. The Great War was over, but its consequences would reshape the world for generations to come. The human cost was almost incomprehensible. Over 16 million people had died, including 9 million soldiers and 7 million civilians. Entire generations of young men had been wiped out. France lost 1.4 million soldiers, Britain 900,000, Germany 2 million, and Russia perhaps 2.5 million. The United States, which entered the war late, still lost over 100,000 men in just 18 months of fighting. The war's end brought no real peace, only an armistice. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was less a negotiated settlement than a victor's justice imposed on the defeated. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, surrender territory, and limit its military to 100,000 men. These harsh terms would poison European politics for the next 2 decades and contribute directly to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of World War II. The Great War destroyed 4 empires. The German, Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman empires all collapsed, replaced by new nations that often bore little relation to ethnic or cultural realities. The new map of Europe, drawn by diplomats in Paris, created numerous minorities trapped within hostile borders. Poland was reborn after 123 years of partition, but included millions of Germans and Ukrainians. Czechoslovakia united Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, and Hungarians under one roof. Yugoslavia attempted to unite South Slavs who shared little beyond their Slavic heritage. The war accelerated social changes that had been building for decades. Women, having proven their capability in factories and offices, won the right to vote in many countries. Class distinctions, while not eliminated, were permanently altered by the shared sacrifice of war. The old aristocratic order, already weakening before 1914, received its death blow in the trenches of France and Belgium. technology advanced at a breakneck pace during the war years. Aircraft evolved from fragile reconnaissance platforms to sophisticated fighters and bombers. Tanks, first used by the British at Floers-Courcelette in 1916, would revolutionize ground warfare. Radio communication allowed for unprecedented coordination of military operations. Medical advances, driven by the urgent need to treat horrific wounds, saved thousands of lives and advanced the practice of surgery by decades. The psychological impact of the war was perhaps as profound as its physical destruction. The optimistic belief in progress that had characterized the 19th century lay shattered in no man's land. A generation of artists, writers, and intellectuals struggled to make sense of the senseless slaughter they had witnessed. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon gave voice to the disillusionment of their generation. Owen's famous lines, "My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity," captured the mood of an entire generation. The economic consequences of the war were equally severe. European nations had spent their accumulated wealth of centuries in just 4 years. Britain, once the world's creditor, emerged as a debtor. The United States, which had entered the war as a debtor nation, emerged as the world's leading creditor. The global balance of economic power had shifted decisively westward across the Atlantic. Inflation ravaged the economies of the defeated nations. Germany's attempt to pay war reparations by printing money led to hyperinflation so severe that it took wheelbarrows full of marks to buy a loaf of bread. Life savings were wiped out overnight, and the middle class, the backbone of democratic society, was left impoverished and embittered. This economic chaos created the conditions in which extremist movements could flourish. The war also accelerated the decline of European colonialism. Colonial subjects who had fought and died for their European masters began to question why they should remain subject to foreign rule. India, which had contributed over 1 million soldiers to the British war effort, began to demand independence more forcefully. The war had weakened the colonial powers while strengthening the desire for self-determination among subject peoples. Perhaps most tragically, the Great War failed to achieve any of the noble goals for which it was supposedly fought. It was not the war to end all wars as H.G. Wells had hoped, nor did it make the world safe for democracy as Woodrow Wilson had promised. Instead, it created the conditions for an even more destructive conflict just 20 years later. The seeds of World War II were planted in the peace settlements of 1919. The harsh treatment of Germany created a desire for revenge that Hitler would expertly exploit. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire created instability in the Middle East that continues to this day. The Russian Revolution brought to power a communist regime that would challenge the West for the next 70 years. Yet the war also created new institutions aimed at preventing future conflicts. The League of Nations, though ultimately unsuccessful, represented humanity's first serious attempt at international organization. The concept of self-determination, promoted by Wilson, would inspire liberation movements around the world. The war's horrific casualties led to new international laws governing the conduct of warfare, though these would prove inadequate to prevent future atrocities. The Great War marked the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the modern world. Before 1914, Europeans believed in progress, civilization, and the superiority of their culture. After 1918, such certainties were no longer possible. The war had shown that civilized nations were capable of barbarism on an unprecedented scale, that technology could be used for destruction as easily as construction, and that progress was not inevitable. The veterans who returned from the war carried physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. Many suffered from what was then called shell shock, a condition that medical authorities often treated with suspicion or contempt. Only decades later would society begin to understand the profound psychological trauma inflicted by modern warfare. The lost generation of writers and artists who survived the war spent their lives trying to make sense of what they had experienced. The war's impact on women was complex and contradictory. While the conflict opened new opportunities for female employment and led to women's suffrage in many countries, the return of male veterans often pushed women back into traditional roles. The war had demonstrated women's capabilities, but had not fundamentally altered patriarchal attitudes. The changes brought by the war would be consolidated only gradually over the following decades. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919, which killed more people than the war itself, was directly linked to the conflict. Overcrowded military camps, mass troop movements, and weakened immune systems created ideal conditions for the virus to spread. The pandemic killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people worldwide, dwarfing even the massive casualties of the war. This double catastrophe left the world reeling and contributed to the sense that civilization itself was in crisis. The war's environmental impact, though not well understood at the time, was enormous. Entire forests were destroyed by artillery bombardments. Vast areas of France and Belgium were so contaminated by unexploded shells and chemical weapons that they remain dangerous to this day. The red zone around Verdun is still largely uninhabitable, a permanent scar on the landscape that serves as a reminder of the war's destructive power. The technological innovations of the war would reshape civilian life in the decades that followed. Commercial aviation grew out of military aircraft development. Radio broadcasting, perfected for military communication, would revolutionize entertainment and information. Medical advances made during the war improved civilian healthcare. Even fashion was influenced by the war, as practical clothing designed for women workers became more widely accepted. The war also accelerated the development of modern propaganda techniques. Governments learned to manipulate public opinion through carefully crafted messages, striking posters, and emotional appeals. These techniques would be further refined by totalitarian regimes in the 1920s and 1930s, with devastating consequences for democracy and human rights. As we look back on the Great War more than a century later, its lessons remain painfully relevant. The war demonstrated how quickly civilization can collapse, how easily nations can stumble into conflict, and how difficult it is to make peace once war has begun. It showed that technology amplifies human destructiveness as well as human creativity, and that the costs of modern war are almost always greater than anyone anticipates. The war also revealed the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Faced with unimaginable horror, soldiers on all sides displayed remarkable courage, loyalty, and compassion. They cared for wounded comrades, shared their meager rations with prisoners, and maintained their humanity even in the most inhumane circumstances. Their sacrifice was not meaningless, even if the causes for which they fought proved to be flawed or misguided. The Great War stands as a watershed in human history, the moment when the modern world was born in blood and fire. Its consequences rippled across the 20th century and continue to shape our world today. The maps drawn in 1919 still largely define the Middle East. The Russian Revolution of 1917 led directly to the Cold War. The economic disruption caused by the war contributed to the Great Depression and the rise of fascism. Perhaps most importantly, the Great War taught humanity about the true nature of modern warfare. Never again could anyone claim that war was glorious or romantic. The reality of industrial-scale killing, of poison gas and machine guns, of shell shock and mass graves, had been seared into the collective memory. This knowledge would not prevent future wars, but it would forever change how we think about them. The 11 o'clock hour on November 11, 1918, marked not just the end of the fighting, but the end of an era. The world that emerged from the Great War was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. For years of unprecedented destruction had transformed not just the map of Europe, but the very nature of human society. The optimism and certainty of the pre-war world had died in the mud of Flanders, and in its place emerged a more complex, more uncertain, but perhaps more realistic understanding of human nature and human limitations. The Great War reminds us that the price of peace is eternal vigilance, that the institutions of civilization are more fragile than we might wish, and that the consequences of political failure can be measured not just in years or decades, but in generations. It stands as both a warning and a warning of what can happen when diplomacy fails and nationalism triumphs over humanity, and a challenge to build a world where such catastrophes become truly impossible. The guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, but their echoes continue to reverberate through history. In every memorial to the fallen, in every museum that preserves the artifacts of that terrible conflict, in every classroom where teachers struggle to convey the magnitude of the tragedy, the Great War continues to teach its bitter lessons about the price of hatred, the value of peace, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity.